And then it developed, and really, the institutional investors had a very large hand in pushing a development of ESG criteria. And the primary direction of it was to try to measure when these kinds of different factors, and there are many factors that are not traditionally financially material factors that you would see in annual reports to the SEC, for example, to what extent do they affect the bottom line? To what extent are they financially material?
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today.
There continues to be a deep discussion about the path of ESG. Some of the discussion is around the ethical side of things. You have various levels of investment, which can be designed to capitalize on the potential profit that can be gained, but you also have to have a focus on the benefits that can be brought forward to the public at large. And how do those two balance each other out? A new book tackles these ethical questions. Wharton's Eric Orts is co-author of the new book titled The Ethics of ESG, and he joins us right now. Hi, Eric. Great to catch up again.
Hi, and great to see you again, too. Thanks for asking me on here.
Thank you. So you and I have talked about ESG in one form or another, I think for about 15 years now, as long as I have been connected with Wharton. As you look back over this time, how do you think the world around ESG has kind of evolved during that time frame?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, I think since we've been talking, ESG really has come into being. So the origin story of ESG is that the United Nations met with a number of large institutional investors and said, "Hey, we want you to do something about large topics that are affecting the whole world, including the climate change problem, biodiversity loss, um, social issues like human rights, using slavery to produce goods." So there was a push then to get the investing community on board with some kind of general project. And that's where ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance criteria, got its start. And then it developed, and really, the institutional investors had a very large hand in pushing a development of ESG criteria. And the primary direction of it was to try to measure when these kinds of different factors, and there are many factors that are not traditionally financially material factors that you would see in annual reports to the SEC, for example, to what extent do they affect the bottom line? To what extent are they financially material? And the idea there was that there were there was a lot of low-hanging fruit on this issue. And there's also an idea that if you take, for example, climate change, there's a long-term effect that may not have been economic effect. They may not have been taken into account by a lot of businesses that are just looking very short-term. So the basic idea in the original conception, at least as the institutional investors saw it, was that you were improving the financial materiality measures, and that this would help to have a win-win solution. So you'd get some gain on issues like climate, et cetera, but
Right.
that would be because you'd be having long-term financial gain. The problem is that also in this picture was the United Nations, and notably not in the picture particularly strongly were nonprofit organizations that care about issues like climate and human rights and other things, because their interest is not only in financial materiality, they care about actually making a difference that the world feels. So in
Right.
other words, you really have a reduction of human rights violations, or you have a reduction in traffic and sexual trafficking. You have a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not just because you care about the long-term economic health of investors. It's because you care about everybody having a collective achievement. So that kind of tension that really goes back to the time when we were talking uh, 15 years ago is still there. There's a tension between these two kinds of forces, and what we see now is an updating of that. Um, and we also have seen, you have to put on the table a politicization of
Yeah.
this issue so that it's not just business trying to do one thing or another, it's also become politicized. And so the acronym ESG has joined the acronym DEI as a targeted um, uh, enemy for for some political forces. And part of the problem there is that there's a lot of misinterpretation.
Right.
One of the problems with the acronym is it means different things for different people. And then when one side that has a lot of influence and is currently in power in Washington has targeted the whole idea, then you're going to have a retreat away from it because you don't want to be, no business really wants to get in the line of fire of the White House right now.
And so the book tackles kind of that balance, I guess, that needs to be looked at even greater, the morality of how you approach ESG as we move forward, both from the business side, but also from those that are concerned about the environment and climate change and more. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. So what we do in this is the subtitle is that we critically assess what's happening with ESG. And we try to go beyond sort of, yes, it's good, no, it's not good, into understanding what are different people talking about in this debate. And we have different perspectives that are represented. So some people some of the contributors, Lisa Fairfax at Penn Law School and Joseph Heath at University of Toronto are examples, really think that this will work still if we focus the understanding of ESG on shareholders
Right.
so that we continue with what I would call sort of mainstream ESG, which is trying to explain to people, no, this is really just about financial materiality. So it's really the same kind of thing that businesses have been expected to be doing for a long time before you had ESG. It's just improving that process, and we really have to stay with that. Now, others of us, and I'm included on this side, are saying, well, wait a second, this really it doesn't always make sense, and it's confusing. If you're saying, for example, we're measuring our environmental impact, and part of that's climate. But if you're then saying, but it's only when it's affecting the financial materiality,
Right.
that is not covering what most people understand if you say we're acting to help the environment. And so one really interesting development that we've seen here adopts that point of view, and that point of view and that's in Europe. So the European Union has adopted has adopted a series of corporate sustainability and financial sustainability regulations
Right.
that attempt to solve this by saying, no, you also have to report on something called impact sustainability, the actual effects you're having on the climate. So you're moving toward a double materiality standard in Europe, and on the other hand, in the United States and other countries, there's not that view. China has adopted an ESG interpretation, and once China says we're doing ESG, then everyone in China has to do ESG.
Right.
But the
Right.
system works a little differently. So what you have is a continuing evolution of what we're really talking about here. And whether we're going to continue to call this ESG or not, I think is an open question because a number of people have said, look, what are we really looking at? If we're really going to, maybe we should drill down and just look at the climate, for example,
Right.
or other particular issues without trying to put everything that is not an ordinary business concern into this bucket called ESG that's not very well defined.
And I guess is the hope by being able to do that, that you can get more people, countries on board to have a better understanding of what the actual attainable goal is, so you can get more people focusing on that area and you can have a better outcome down the road.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, to give credit where it's due, I think that, I mean, I saw the political backlash against ESG coming early on, and actually when it was first being proposed, and when schools like the Wharton School were standing up ESG programs too, and we've adjusted to the to this criticism as well over time. But the problem, in some ways, the criticism is correct because there was a way in which the institutional investors that I think had a good spirit about this. I think they really wanted to do good with this.
Hmm.
But the way it comes across to people is that, wait a second, who gave Vanguard and the big institutional investors the right to decide that to push on this issue?
Right.
And their defense was, well, no, we're just being financially responsible here. That's all that ESG is. But when you call it ESG, then people don't, it's hard for
Yes.
people to believe it.
Yeah.
And when you have a critique, to some extent, I think it's valid, of elites, a criticism of the elites of the world pushing down their view on other folks. That's part of what's driven a populist backlash, I think, in the United States. And to some extent, I think what that means is you really do have to integrate this into a legitimate political shift. And
Hmm.
what I think that means, and this is my own personal opinion, not all, I'm not representing all of the authors in this book, and it's a co-edited book. But what I think you have to get down to is everyone agreeing to some kind of a regulation. I
Right.
mean, when I first got into this, I went to the Wharton paid for me to go to the original Earth Summit. This is showing how old I am because I was just starting here in
I thought that was last year,
1992.
Eric. I thought that was
Yeah,
just last year.
yeah, unfortunately not. It was in 1992. George H.W. Bush was hosting the U.S. side on that, and there was a major treaty that was agreed about climate, saying this we need a framework for dealing with this. And there's a
Right.
major treaty agreed about biodiversity. I also was amazed to see a huge business contingent that was there.
Right.
And so already then businesses were getting involved and saying, we understand this is a problem for everybody.
Right.
And I think what we need to get back to is that sort of like a consensus where you have everyone kind of agreeing that this is a problem, and then it works through the regular political process. You can't just say we're going to do it. All the big companies and big investors of the world are going to do this, because then I think we run into this political backlash. And my sense, one other footnote there is, I don't think that's going to last forever. If you
Right.
talk to a lot of the big businesses and investors, et cetera, the science doesn't really lie, and people still have to orient the risks that their businesses are taking, et cetera. I just heard from a top executive in an insurance company in my class yesterday, where one of my colleagues calls it green hushing.
Yeah.
They still recognize, look, if you're an insurance company, you can't say, well, it's not politically favorable to worry about the climate problem anymore because it's changing your risk profiles. If you write insurance in California, you can't
Yeah.
pretend that wildfires aren't breaking out more frequently and burning more houses down, right? And that's true of a lot of big major players. So I think you'll see that pendulum shift back eventually, even in the United States. And the other thing to say is this is really mostly a US phenomenon right now, this backlash against ESG. And in many other countries, you still have this development of new standards, new legislation, et cetera, that we're gonna see.
Right. And so then that leads me to believe that we are still a ways away from having some middle ground that we'll be able to find where all parties are kind of in unison of focusing on the importance of this topic, understanding that there's a financial component to it, but also working through the moral side of this as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I've been teaching in business ethics and in sustainability and the business law side for a long time. And it's not really new. This is an
Yeah.
issue that we have, a tension that we have in our system. On the one hand, our market-based, rules-based system has been incredibly productive and beneficial for many people. At the same time, it doesn't always consider some of the ethical issues or the social issues that are really important to maintaining the actual system.
Right.
So I think that's ESG is part of that more general process that we're always negotiating, I think, as long as we have that kind of system. And I hope we continue to do that because the livelihood of many billions of people is depending
Yeah.
on us to getting that right.
Eric, I appreciate the time today. All the best, sir.
All right. Thanks for the time, too.
You got it. Eric Orts, a professor at the Wharton School. The book is titled The Ethics of ESG. There it is, right there. It is available for your pickup and purchase to read at your convenience. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.